we're back. Did you have a good vacation?
Oh, it was wonderful. Went to Colorado. It was amazing.
I think we all needed the time off, and we think we probably feel that some of our audience was going off and doing their vacations. So we hope you had a good time off if you managed to do that towards the end of August or any time since we were last here. But my name is Ann Merchant, and I want to welcome all of you, we hope, back to this week's virtual event, Punctuating Stereotypes, and I'm going to get this right, and their impact on identity. So we're especially pleased, of course, to have today's speaker and expert on this topic, Claude Steele, with us here today. But we're also, of course, as I said, very happy to have all of you back. But I am, as always, joined by...
Oh, I'm Rick Lovert. I'm the program director of the Science and Entertainment Exchange, a program of the National Academy of Sciences.
Exactly. So, I know a lot of people think about science just from the point of view, perhaps of physics or chemistry, or as some people like to call them, the hard sciences. But our friends at the Division on Behavioral and Social Sciences and Education would say, oh no, the social sciences are the hardest sciences of all. And we very much like to feature the social science on our stage because they're sometimes some of the most intriguing sciences, because they're the science of us, of human behavior, which is oftentimes extremely hard and very complex. The Academy's Division on Social Sciences does a lot of work on implicit bias, on diversity in the STEM workforce, and they have done a number of studies on addressing the biological, the social, and the organizational components of what success and sometimes those barriers to success look like in science and engineering. So we were very happy to be able to do this today. I also want to point to some of the work that same division does in the same kind of realm, but on health equity during COVID. So that's especially relevant. So I think Sachi's going to drop a couple of links in the chat that you can follow. And I would especially recommend the work that we've done as part of the Henry and Berna David lecture series, which is on the social sciences. But certainly one of the reasons that the Science and Entertainment Exchange exists, and one of our motivations for creating this program, was because we had been looking at the stereotypes that we were seeing in film and television. And a lot of what the exchange tries to do is to puncture those stereotypes by putting new topics and new people in front of our audiences. So Rick, I'm going to turn it to you to talk a little bit about that work at the exchange.
That's right. If you're a writer, director, studio executive, actor, storyteller in a mass media format, and you have a question about science, don't forget those documentary filmmakers. You can call us at 844-NEET-SCI, and I think Sachi's going to drop that down in there too, and hopefully have your questions answered as you develop your stories. We've done over 3,300 consults since we opened our doors, 12 years ago? Oh my goodness. So if you are a STEM professional and you're just hearing about us because this is the first event you've tuned into, please do reach out, because we are always looking for volunteers. We found some amazing people this year, actually, during the pandemic, which is an unexpected outcome for us. But please do contact us. We're always looking for people to connect to storytellers in all fields, as Anne said. If you're a social scientist, you're still a scientist.
That's right.
So I'd like to thank today's sponsor, HHMI, without whose support we would not be doing these events. So thank you very much for keeping these particular lights on. Also, we get major funding from the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation and many individual donors like you. There were a ton of you for this event today. We got a lot of support and we really do appreciate it. We put that money right back into making these events. We combine it with our money from Howard Hughes. So thank you very much. Also want to thank Courtney, Sachi, Jeff, Mandy, and Thomas for all of your tech support and back-end support making this event happen. We couldn't do it without you. Today's event, it's going to be, in a moment, you will meet Professor Steele. He will come on and he will speak for probably about 20 minutes. And at any time during his talk, you can ask a question and I will be dutifully keeping track of all of your questions. And when we come back for Q&A, I will be the voice of the audience. So I'll try to get to as many as possible. We usually only have about 10 or 15 minutes max to get to as many questions as we can, but I will do my best to get to everything today. And then some of you have also signed up for our VIP Q&A, which was a separate ticket, or if you have joined us in the past at the supporter level for 2021, you should have gotten an invite to this. And that will be on video, but that's a separate thing. So if you do have a question and you haven't joined for that extra Q&A, please just put it in the chat and I will pull it and get to as many as possible. So that brings me to my rabbit hole of the week, which is the thing that I just couldn't keep my eyes off of while I was researching this event. And it's a Penn State study that I found on how stereotypes in the real world carry into video game avatars. So if you are playing like World of Warcraft and you encounter an orc that has certain aspects or maybe is gendered, you are likely as a player to carry the same stereotypes into the virtual world as you have in the real world. Crazy.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I have to confess that my rabbit hole has absolutely nothing to do topically with today's event, because we usually try to have them have some kind of connection. But I just can't help but mention the fact that there are zebras loose in my neighborhood. This has been picked up by the BBC. It was written up in the Guardian. It's been all over, not just local news, but national news, because I live in Upper Marlboro, Maryland. It's about 20 miles outside of Washington, and I live in a kind of rural area, and there is a farm about a mile from us that does have a license to keep some exotic animals that they rescue, and the zebras got loose. So my little known fact that I picked up on is that it's not a herd of zebras. There are 3 on the loose. So technically they're maybe not a herd, but it's a dazzle of zebras. So there you go. You can find out some, and they think that striping in zebras has to do with when they're in large numbers in that dazzle, that the striping confuses the predators. So nothing to do with, I don't know, maybe there's a stereotype about zebras. I'm not sure, but that's what I know about the zebras in my neighborhood. So Sachi will give you a link to that Guardian story, and you can find those pictures of the zebras in my neighborhood. But of course, what we're all here for is to hear Claude Steele talk about his work at the on stereotype threat. And we always feel very privileged when we can have a member of the National Academy of Sciences on our stage. And to be a member of the National Academy of Sciences, it's not about sending in box tops or asking for a membership application. It is the highest honor in American science to be elected as a member of the Academy. And it's a very rarefied group. There are not, I think we have at any given time around 2,000 members of the Academy. And so we feel very privileged when we can get, for us, that's a win, that's a snag when we can get somebody of Claude's stature to come and talk about work that has earned him the privilege of being elected to the Academy. So with that, we're going to ask Claude to turn on his camera and his microphone as we leave the stage and hand it over to him, because we know that's why all of you are here. So thank you so much, Claude. And we are going to be listening when we go away. Thank you.
Thank you. It is hard to follow a dazzle of zebras, I have to admit. A challenge, let's put it that way. I guess my job today is to talk about the impact of stereotypes, and in particular, the phenomenon of stereotype threat, what it is, how it works, and in particular, the role it plays in some of society's most important challenges around diversity, around performance of minority groups and women in certain areas of academic life and the like. So that's the general topic, what stereotype is, what its effects are, and also how to fix it, how to remedy some of these undesired effects that stereotype threat can have, to just give us a rounded understanding of what that phenomenon is and how it can be an important part of our lives. So I'll jump right in for my 20 minutes. Stereotype threat is a very simple, straightforward phenomenon. Everybody has some version of it, maybe even several times a day or a week or something like that. It's a fairly frequent experience that we human beings have. It's simply being in a situation or doing something for which a negative stereotype about one of our identities is relevant. One of our identities, race, gender, age, religion, region of the country, language, immigrant status, sexual orientation. When we're in a situation where a negative stereotype about one of those identities is relevant, we know that we could be judged or treated in terms of that stereotype. And if the situation we're in is important to us, maybe important to our future, the prospect of being judged in terms of that negative stereotype can be upsetting and distracting, and can interfere with our functioning right there in the immediate situation. And if we experience that on a regular basis in certain areas of life, think about women in advanced STEM fields, for example, enduring the stereotype about women's math ability and the like. I bring that up right away because it is an area in which there is a lot of research, and it's an important impact of stereotypes. That pressure of being seen that way in an area that you care a great deal about and that's important to you can, as I say, be upsetting and can interfere with your performance in that domain and your persistence, your willingness to stay in that domain of life. So that's what stereotype threat is. It's just this simple experience. As I say, some experiences of it are kind of trivial and not so significant. I don't know why, but I've experienced more of it in relation to age. When my son-in-law has to, take 45 minutes to help me learn how to turn my new television on. I'm experiencing a sense that he could be judging me in terms of stereotypes about older people and our technological competence. Now, that's a kind of a humorful situation, doesn't have a lot of significant consequences to it. I've lured him into helping me, so I'm okay. I'll endure a little of the stereotype judgment there. But there are other walks of life where, maybe as I alluded to a moment ago, women in advanced STEM fields, African Americans in academic life, two areas that we've done research on, where that stereotype pressure can be a lot more consequential and a much more serious aspect of one's life. So I want to start by giving you some examples of the experiments, the research that we do to demonstrate the effect of it. I'm going to talk really about the effects of this phenomenon in two areas of life. One is performance, in particular academic performance, although a lot of research looks at stereotype threats effect in other kinds of performance, like athletic performance. I'm going to focus on academic performance today. Bring up the implications for athletics in the questions and answers if you're curious. Performance is one area, and the other is just the ability to have a successfully diverse society, a society in which we all feel that we are free and able to contribute to a community from the standpoint of our identities and our backgrounds, and yet we won't be discriminated against on the basis of those of that identity and background. Achieving that kind of community within our institutions, within our classrooms, within our corporations, within almost any kind of grouping in American society. That's the second area where I'm going to address the role of stereotype threat today and what the kind of challenge it represents for achieving that kind of a successfully diverse community. Okay, performance, simple, straightforward study. This was done in two places, Princeton and Arizona State. And this was looking at the effects of stereotype threat on an athletic performance. Actually, I maybe misled you there. I am going to talk about athletic performance, but you can see how it might generalize to academic performance. This was a golfing task. The investigators brought in elite athletes, white athletes, African-American athletes at these two universities, and they asked them to perform a golfing task. And they described and the golfing task was 10 holes of golf in a laboratory golf course, just a laboratory room with 10 holes. And the performance was, how did they do? How many strokes did it take them to get the ball through that course? So to impose stereotype threats on the white athletes, again, these are elite athletes, they care about, that's an important component of stereotype threat, is caring about the domain of performance. They're identified with being good athletes. So just before they began the golfing task, the experimenter says to them, look, we want you to do the best you can today. This is a test of natural athletic ability. We want you to do the best you can. Well, for the white athletes in our society, that is a little bit of a negative stereotype. If you pay attention to sports commentary, you're probably going to pick up some themes, stereotype type themes that maybe it's black athletes that have a lot of natural athletic ability, and it's white athletes that have a lot of skill and determination and so on. And so if you're asking me to do a task as a white athlete, and you're telling me it's a task of natural athletic ability, I might feel like I'm at risk of confirming that stereotype. And as I go through the golf course and experience the inevitable frustration that I'm going to have trying to golf through those holes, I could worry that, am I confirming that stereotype about white athletes? Am I confirming that, or will I be seen to confirm that? And that little extra thought and worry starts to actually interfere with performance. The theory goes, the idea goes. Whereas for the black athletes, they're not negatively stereotyped. They in that way, that is not something they're under suspicion about in our stereotype structure of American society. They're seen as having natural ability. So if they experience frustration on the task, it doesn't mean the same thing. Doesn't mean that they may lack natural ability or be seen that way. So here's a stereotype in society coming down into the lives of these athletes as they perform a task. And sure enough, the white athletes perform significantly worse than the black athletes on that golfing task. But interestingly, another condition of the experiment reverses the stereotype threat pressure. In that condition of the experiment, the golfing task isn't described as a test of natural ability. It's described rather as a test of sports strategic intelligence. That's a negative stereotype attached to the identity of being African American. And so now, as another group of black and white athletes do this golfing task, the black athletes are under the pressure of a negative stereotype, of confirming the negative stereotype or being seen to confirm it. So as they golf through that and they're experience that frustration, they're worried now. Am I confirming that negative stereotype about my group, or will I be seen to? Is that what this frustration means? And that extra worry could interfere with their performance, and indeed it doesn't. And in that condition, black athletes underperform in relation to white athletes. So here you have stereotypes in society, just out there in society, in the air, as we've often described them, coming down into the lives of people because of their relevance to the task they're doing. And having an effect on their performance, affecting their performance right then and there in the immediate situation. When that stereotype threat pressure is relieved, their performance goes up to a much higher unobstructed level, so to speak. But when that stereotype threat pressure is there, their performance is lower, troubled by the worry over whether they're confirming the stereotype or not. Think about a woman who is a very good math student. It's one of the first experiments we did in this area. Women and men who were really good math students at the University of Michigan, and we brought them into the lab one at a time, and we gave them a very difficult math test, something that we knew would cause frustration for them. Even though they're good, this was hard. And we reasoned that this would be a different experience for women in American society than it would be for men. For men, as they experienced the frustration on that math test, they could worry that they're not as good at math as they thought they were, and maybe I'm in the wrong line of career path. But for the women, they would have that worry and the additional worry that they're maybe confirming through this frustration they're having on the test, they're confirming the stereotype about women in our society, the stereotype that exists in our society about women having less math ability, lower math ability than men. So they are worried as they take that math test, that time standardized test, half hour, difficult test. They have this interfering worry that they could be confirming or be seen to confirm this negative stereotype about them as women. And sure enough, they didn't perform as well as the men, even though we had matched them in math ability through a very careful set of matching procedures. But what shows the effect of stereotype threat is, well, what happens if you take the stereotype threat pressure off of the women in that situation? We did another condition of the experiment where we did that, and we did it in a very simple way. Just before the students sat down to take the test, again alone in a room, we told them, look, you may have heard that women don't do as well as men on difficult standardized math tests. You may have heard that, but that's not true for the test you're taking today. For the test you're taking today, women always do as well as men. So with that simple sentence, the relevance of the stereotype in our society is kind of blocked. It's not relevant to this test I'm taking today, because this is a test on which women always do as well as men. So with that relief from the stereotype threat pressure, women's scores go up to match that of equally skilled men. No difference there between the two. So these kind of evidence give us some sense that when you look out in society and you see in the nature of stereotypes that exist out there, that they can have very meaningful effects on people, on important performances in people's lives. And also these effects can extend out over time. That, for example, a woman might feel if she experiences that kind of extra pressure on a regular basis, maybe this just isn't field that I really want to be in. Maybe there's another way for me to maybe I'll become a history major where there isn't the same kind of gender stereotype at play that is relevant in that situation. I'll be free of this pressure there. She's not thinking this all self-consciously. She's just probably reacting more to a sense of comfort or discomfort in the domain where the stereotype is relevant. So an awful lot of stereotype threat research over the last 25 years has focused on showing these various effects of stereotype pressures on performances that are important in our society. Sometimes performances that are less important, but often performances that are very important. The other problem I wanted to talk about was the problem of successful diversity. How do you have a diverse a community as I say, in an institution, or even in your classroom, or in your church, or in your corporation? How do you make diversity work? We're one of the few societies, maybe the only society in the world that has ever made the kind of public commitment and commitment in law to having a genuinely identity diverse society. And so the question is, how do we make that work? And in answering that question is the question, well, what's difficult about it? What's hard about diversity in a society? Why can't it just automatically work? People just come together, accept each other, and have that be sufficient. Well, I think an understanding of stereotype threat can explain some of the difficulty, some of the challenge in making our diverse communities, our diverse environments work. I'll give you an example of a conversation, the hypothetical conversation between a teacher and parents over a student. It's a standard parent-teacher conference, let's say, about an African-American student who's in the 7th grade. So the parents are coming in to talk to the 7th grade teacher about their young man who was a student in her class. And the parents in this conversation are African-American. And the teacher in this situation is white. You can maybe already sense from that there could be a certain tension in this conversation. And I think one way of elucidating what that tension might be, and thus, as I'm going to talk in a minute, how to fix that tension, but elucidating what that tension might be is in terms of the concept of stereotype threat. Both parties in that conversation have a form of stereotype threat that comes down to us from our history as a society, and the way that race has been used as a way of stratifying our society, and the stereotypes that our society has has developed in order to justify that stratification, that racial stratification of society. So as the African-American couple drive over to the school to have this conference with their son's teacher, they're worried that they know what the stereotypes about African Americans are, and they're taking this as their opportunity to really help this teacher and the school not see their son in terms of those stereotypes, not to see him in terms of stereotypes about intellectual ability, belongingness, and intellectual aspects of life, and maybe even aggressiveness too. They don't want their son to be seen that way. They want the school to jettison those stereotypes and see the real potential, the intellectual potential in this child, and to invest in developing that potential. And this is their opportunity to help that happen. So they're on the edge of their seats in this conversation, trying to get that teacher and that school to not use the stereotypes that they know are out there about their group and about that identity. That's how they're dealing with the stereotype threat they're focusing on. They're pushing back on the stereotypes in a mighty way. Well, and for her part in the conversation, teacher's part in the conversation, as she prepares for it, she too is dealing with a powerful form of stereotype threat. She could fear that anything critical she might say about this young seventh grader, it might be said out of the best intentions to help that child and through a real investment in trying to develop that child's abilities. The criticism might be said from that kind of motive, but she knows if it's criticism, it could get her seen in terms of the negative stereotype about whites in society as racist. And that would be a terrible, upsetting experience for her. So she goes into this conversation also on the edge of her seat, trying to manage, here we are, here those parties are, trying to manage the ghosts of stereotypes that are right there in their midst and affecting their behavior and their ability to relate to each other. Most fundamentally, it could be that it's making it difficult for them to trust each other. And where does that come from? Well, that comes from our history as a society. And as I said, the stereotypes that have evolved over that history has assigned us to different roles, and then it's created stereotypes about those different roles. And we might want to think that history is all in the past, but here it is right in the present, right in the moment, sitting there in the room, affecting the way in which these parties feel toward each other and the way, the kind of tension they feel in the situation. It is making us, that history and the resulting stereotypes are making it difficult for those parties to simply trust each other. So these kinds of forms of stereotype threat can make it difficult for a diverse society to come together in the way we might all want it to come together, in a trusting, simple, straightforward way. But how can we rule that possibility out, that I can just trust that? I'll give you a research example there too. We asked the question in a study, Jeff Cohen, Lee Ross, and I, how does a white teacher, white professor, give critical feedback to a Black student and have that feedback be trusted? How do you do that? Simple experiment, we had white and Black Stanford students come into the laboratory one at a time, write an essay about their favorite teacher, with the idea that if it was good, it might be published in a campus magazine on teaching. And then they would come back 2 days later and they would get feedback on the essay that they wrote. And we were interested, of course, in how much they trusted that feedback. And then based on how much they trusted that feedback, how motivated by the feedback were they to improve their essays? So that's the structure of the experiment. And we just varied how we gave the feedback. Well, one of the more unsettling findings in our research is that when we gave the feedback straightforwardly, here's the feedback on your essay, or we preceded it with a compliment. You bring a lot of good energy to my class. I know who you are. Black students didn't trust that feedback. White students did. They're not dealing with a stereotype in that situation and a history about how they might be seen, how their abilities might be evaluated in that situation. But Black students didn't trust it. And it can seem really strange because these are really strong students at a privileged situation at a great university. Why wouldn't they trust the feedback that these adults are giving them in this situation? But when you think about it, you can begin to see what I mean by trust and the significance that trust can have. This kind of trust just can have. They don't know whether the feedback is coming from their essay and its quality, or whether it's coming from the feedback giver's views of their group's abilities, given the stereotypes out there in American society and the history of American society and its ongoing organization around race. And they can't quite be sure that they can trust that feedback. And then not trusting the feedback, they're not going to be motivated to use it, really. And this isn't something that just happened once and it's over. It's a condition of their life in those kinds of situations, this challenge to trust that makes it difficult, coming down from the stereotypes in our society, the challenge that it gives them to trust. I think of it as a tension between remembering and forgetting. Remembering how my group is seen and using that as a way of interpreting what's happening to me in this immediate situation, versus forgetting how my group has been treated and seen in this society and just trusting the immediate situation, forgetting. It's a tension between that. That helps, I think, capture the tension that the student might feel in that situation. And it pinpoints a precise challenge for our society's educational and I think work-life situation that we have to realize the importance of that history mediated through stereotypes can have in our lives, and the need for our institutions to address that in some way, to build that kind of trust. Our institutions were formed in an era when we, most of them, many of the important ones, in an era when we lived in a pretty much apartheid society. We weren't trying to educate a full diversity of people. We don't have the pedagogy for that. Well, I'm arguing that an effective pedagogy is a pedagogy that understands this challenge of trust, the role that stereotypes can play, and tries to address it. How do you do it? Quickly, I know I must be running out of time now, but I'll just give you two quick examples. There was a way of giving that feedback that was effective and that Black students did trust, and it was very simple. The feedback giver simply said, look, we're using high standards in evaluating these essays because we may publish them in this magazine on teaching using high standards. But I've looked at your essay and I believe you have the potential. He didn't say ability. He said, I believe you have the potential to meet those high standards. Here's the feedback. Well, with that, the Black students trusted it and were 3 times more motivated to improve their essays than participants in any other condition of the experiment. Why did that feedback work so well? Well, it recognized, it gave them 2 signals that they weren't being seen stereotypically. The first is they were being challenged. We have high standards here. You wouldn't challenge somebody like that if you didn't respect their abilities. So that signals that they're not being seen in terms of the racial stereotype about their abilities. And then the feedback giver directly says, I believe you have the potential to do it, and this feedback is designed to help you do it. Well, that's another signal that you're not being seen stereotypically. And with that out of the way, they could trust the feedback. That's the know-how. That's a good example of the know-how that I think our institutions, our instructions, our companies, corporations need to understand is critical for them to work smoothly and effectively the way we'd like them to work. There are lots of ways of signaling that we see people. I'm going to introduce a concept here and then maybe end. I'm not sure exactly where I stand with regard to time, but there's the concept of wiseness. Irving Goffman a great sociologist, did a study of gay Americans in the 1950s, and in that ethnography, he discovered that they had a term for people who saw past the way they were stigmatized, saw past that and saw the full human behind the stigma. That term was wise. So the term would be used something like, "Oh, he's cool, man. He's wise. He sees us. He knows who we are." African Americans have a ton of terms like this. He's cool, man. He gets us. He sees that we're really fully human. Well, it's that capacity that I think that feedback condition I just described illustrates how to do. And it's that capacity that our institutions and our teaching pedagogies need to incorporate. And in questions and answers, I can talk a little bit about how you take that to scale. There are other things I also want to stress. How would that white teacher in that conversation prepare herself for that parent-teacher conversation where she feels under the stereotype threat of being seen as possibly racist? How would she prepare herself? There is a way that we've done a lot of research to establish that enables a person in that predicament to function effectively and to develop trust in that situation. How do you take these ideas to scale? Well, again, maybe in questions and answers, I can turn to some examples of how to do that. There's some distinguished academic units and maybe entire universities and schools that do take these principles to scale and that do greatly mitigate the interfering effects of negative stereotype threats on students' performances and produce dramatic improvements in their outcomes. So with that general promise, I'll end with the following, I hope, hopeful and encouraging note that I want to argue in this line of reasoning that we tend to think of the primary challenge to diversity being one of prejudice, and prejudice is profoundly, it's still with us, sadly, and every society has to make it a primary part of their business to educate people and to try to mitigate prejudice as much as possible. But I want to also point to this whole line of this whole phenomenon of trust that I'm talking about, that trust also is critical. And once trust is established and people feel more comfortable with each other, often that's the best route to mitigating prejudice. That's a big point I want to make. Maybe we should begin in our institutions and in our lives being trustworthy. That tends to bring people together and mitigate the role that bias and prejudice and stereotypes can have in our lives. And trust is a game that everybody can play. It's a game that's played on the ground. It's who listens, who shows up, who listens again, who tries to genuinely help people in concrete, meaningful ways. We trust people who do that for us. And that is a simple approach to how we can move forward in building an effective, diverse society, a line of reasoning that comes out of this. So with that, I'll end and we can turn to questions and answers. Thank you.
Yeah, so I think right off the bat, we've got multiple people who are kind of jumping on that idea that you said about scaling. And I think maybe that ties into building trust. And if you can elaborate a little bit on ways to both, we got questions actually from both sides, both the person who's trying to mitigate what they think might be a stereotype threat, may or may not, and then also from the other side of how to, I think, build that trust as well. I think those are two questions right off the bat.
Yes, with any kind of an environment, let's say it's a school or a particular program or something, or a division within a corporation, there are things that I think you can do in the context to help them, to help build trust. The cues in the situation. We're having this national debate about Confederate monuments. As I, an African American, walk down the streets of Richmond, Virginia, I feel I can trust that society a little more now that those monuments have been redeployed, taken out of public positions of honor. That's a cue, that's a signal in a situation that tells you how much your identity it could be a problem for you in a situation. I had a graduate student, a woman, wanted to take a course in math, went to the math department. to learn about it. She walks down the hallway to get to the receptionist's desk. She goes by 12 photographs of famous mathematicians, and they're all white males. So by the time she gets to the receptionist's desk, she might have in the back of her mind a little worry about, well, will people be able to invest in me in this situation? So cues in a situation, the features of a situation can send signals that can help take these principles to some scale to affect the quality of a whole environment, the degree which a whole environment is trustworthy. Also, I'll give an example of a very elite graduate program that has taken this to scale. Rudy Mendoza-Denton and a number of colleagues at Berkeley, UC Berkeley, did a survey of the physical sciences graduate programs with the question, are the women and minorities doing as well as the men in those graduate programs? Math, chemistry, computer sciences, electrical engineering, astronomy, and so on. These are physical science programs. Are the women and minorities doing as well as the men in those programs in terms of the coin of the realm in graduate school, progress to publication? Are you becoming a participating scientist on being on the path to publication? And they found what you might fear, that no, the women and minorities weren't doing as well on that criterion as the men in all of the departments except chemistry. And for some reason, chemistry, they were. That was the bright spot. Well, I want to argue that program, that chemistry program, used some of the same principles described in that feedback condition. They rolled up their sleeves and they decided we really want to develop the best chemists in the world. In addition to us being great scientists, we wanted to produce great chemists, great scientists. How do you do that? Well, they rolled up their sleeves and they kind of did what that feedback condition illustrated. They said, look, they brought them in 3 weeks early. They said, look, we use high standards here. This is an elite program. You belong here. They gave them that signal directly. Here's what you need to understand about it. They gave them cultural capital they need to succeed in it. This is about publication, not as much about grades as undergraduate school. It's about publication and you learning to be a scientist. And we're going to help you do that. You're going to interview 5 professors and you're going to get some ideas for projects. And to give you some idea of the rate of progress that's important, here's some deadlines. We'd like to have the proposal due by November 11th, the research done by the 3rd of March, and the paper submitted by the 2nd of June. So, and we're going to support you and meet you every a week because we believe you have the potential to do this. So they installed at the program level the same kind of input that feedback condition implemented and achieved this situation not achieved in any of the other units of women and minorities producing at the same rate and at the same quality. What did the other physical science departments? Well, they look more like you might expect, where there are a lot of male faculty. They get along easily with the male graduate students. They talk to them informally more easily. The women and minorities are a little bit kind of outside that intimacy. And the situation is ambiguous to them. They don't know exactly how to allocate their time and what are the real important dimensions of performance they should be doing well on. And so they're subject, that invites in that ambiguity. I call it a sort of toxic ambiguity, invites in worry about whether they're going to be stereotyped and construed in terms of those stereotypes about those groups' abilities. So their experience in a program that's very laissez-faire and unstructured like that is a very weighty kind of experience. It's a kind of program that might have worked well when it was designed to only educate a pretty homogeneous group of largely white males of a certain class. But as it tries to educate a broader set of people, that lack of structure and laissez-fairness opens up the person to having to contend with these stereotypes and how people might see them and worry about that here in a very important part of their life. So it's a highly pressured, weighty situation with lots of ambiguity in it. The chemistry department, college there, takes that off the table. and produces a very different outcome. So that's an example of that. Some universities are really good at that. Right now, the Georgia State is probably the university which is seen as sort of being a leader in this regard of doing many of the same things I just described in the Berkeley College of Chemistry for the whole incoming and for the whole undergraduate student body, supporting them in ways that really help them, encouraging them, meeting the students where they are, and taking a developmental approach toward their education, investing in their education that way. So I don't know, I could go on, but there may be other questions too.
So I think you've done a really great job with that particular question on talking about the built environment and an environment where people are being thoughtful about how to, how to facilitate change. We also have a number of questions that I think are more out in the wild. And I actually kind of like Roberta asks, what are some strategies you used, I think you had said with your son-in-law over the ageism and the perceived ageism around the television. But, I don't know if that story ends well, but I will say, like, just generally, when you're more out in the wild, do you have some sort of general strategies for folks as well?
Well, with my son-in-law, I just endured it because it wasn't a serious form of stereotypes, right? It became a joke. You kind of joke about it. And sometimes I think that can be an effective way of dealing with it, and we probably do it quite intuitively, I think, in our lives. But in these other situations, I'm going to take the question this way: how does a person, how does let's say a male become effective with female graduate students or undergraduate students, or how do they relate and build trust across a racial divide? How does a white person build trust with African-American students or something of that sort? So I want to outline the strategy that way. And there it's a simple one. I think you take yourself as a growth project, and you see the interaction as a possibility to learn about a perspective toward life that you might not know that much about. So rather than performing, as might be the temptation, that I'm not stereotyping you and I'm really committed to fairness, for racial fairness in this society. Rather than perform that, take a different posture toward the situation, one of a curiosity and trying to learn as a strategy. And we put that to an experimental test in research, an experiment done by Phil Goff and a number of other people to arm people with just that instruction. You're about to have a difficult conversation with two African-American conversation partners, and it's going to be about a difficult topic, racial profiling. Here's how you do it. You don't try to prove anything. You just go in and you take it as a learning opportunity, an opportunity for you to learn something. And when you're in doubt, ask questions. Don't explain yourself so much. Sometimes that may be necessary, but by and large, position yourself as a questioner, as somebody who's researching this interaction. In that posture, people feel much less vulnerable to being stereotyped and much more comfortable with each other. So it's an important tactic, I think, in a diverse world. In a world that is more homogeneous, when we're within our own groups, it may not be so important. I don't know. I think it's a generally good strategy, but it's especially useful when we're trying to and have to relate to people across identity differences. There's where there's a certain humility and a certain posture of, I could learn something. And I'm going to try to, with as much politeness as I can manage, I'm going to ask questions and be in that position. And that I think is a very good strategy. I won't take the time to detail the experiment that nicely demonstrates that, but after a long time of thinking about this, we stumbled on this idea of seeing yourself as a project and using your curiosity as an approach.
So actually, quick one, I think. Steve wants to know if there are places where he can find links to some of the studies you mentioned, or if maybe there's a website on the topic that you'd recommend for people for a little bit of follow-up after the event?
Well, there's a book, Whistling Vivaldi, that describes almost all of this research. It's about a decade old now, but much of the research is described there. Certainly, the beginnings of it are described in that book. And so I think that's a simple, readable avenue into this whole way of thinking about diversity and the challenges around stereotypes, the phenomenon of stereotype threat, how it came about, the mystery. I wrote it as a mystery story, and I think it with the intention of depicting how science actually works. We started this research with a whole different set of ideas, but as the research unfolded, we listened to the data, what we found, and these concepts evolved out of that search. And that book tries to convey the progress of that research program. So I think it gives people a good sense of the joy of being a scientist about these things. You can take questions that are really important like these, and you can get to work, and it's like a mystery. You don't have to have some preordained idea about it per se. It helps to have an orientation, but you're going to learn a lot from the actual experience of doing the research, and that book conveys many of the studies I'm referring to, and the whole experience of research.
So Dana has a question about fat stigma, and she wants to know the degree to which fat shaming continues to be pervasive and unchallenged in our society, and she's particularly interested in the effect it can have over the course of a lifetime, receiving messages on both performance and inclusion and exclusion in a broader range of pursuits.
Yes, I think that is, and there is a line of stereotype research on fat stigma and stereotypes about it. So I would refer her to just Google that as a search, and you'll find what's the latest research on that issue. But indeed, it is another identity that has afloat in our society negative stereotypes about it. And when you're in situations where those stereotypes are relevant, which is probably pretty frequent, you're going to experience that kind of pressure. And so it's very much like one of the things about stereotype threat that's important to understand, and maybe this question reflects, is that this pressure isn't something that just happens once, goes away, or that you can disprove and it's never there again. It's a condition of life in the situation where the stereotypes apply. Condition of life. And that this stigma around weight is a good example of that. It's going to be you might in your one classroom disprove to people the stereotype, the negative stereotypes about being overweight. You might disprove that in that situation, but then sooner or later you're going to move to a different classroom with a new set of people, or a different job with a new set of people, and it's going to emerge again. And that's the way, there's a Sisyphean quality to the way stereotype threat attaches to our lives, that you persistently have to disprove it. And that effort to contend with it and disprove it and discount it can shape our personalities and how we function, sometimes in positive ways, I want to point out, not always in negative ways, sometimes in positive ways. Sometimes it makes people very strong and very resilient to negative views of themselves. So it's some of the greatest art, I think, as an African American. I think we have been such an artistic people and such an intellectually interesting people, in part because we're contending with a persistent pressure on us based on our identity and the stereotypes about it. We're not free of that pressure. Those stereotypes apply to us in so many situations. You're on an elevator, people get on, and women hold their purses closer. The story of the title of the book, Whistling Vivaldi, is a story of an African American who's now an editorial writer for the New York Times. That he was a graduate student in Chicago, walking down the streets of Hyde Park, or the South Side of Chicago, and he noticed that big guy dressed like a student, that he made whites nervous. They were avoiding eye contact, walking across the street, and so on. And it made him, it worried him. what he did, independent of this situation, he was learning how to whistle. And he was practicing whistling Beatles tunes and Vivaldi. And so he started going down the street whistling Vivaldi. And he noticed that when people heard that, it punctured the stereotype of him as a possibly menacing African-American male. And he was seen as just another student at the University of Chicago. And everybody was friendly and said hello and so on. Well, it's a good story because it illustrates the nature of stereotypes, right? How he's picking up the sense of how he's seen. And then how we struggle to combat the stereotype, or how we find ways of combating the stereotype. But it also, I think, reveals probably the tragedy of having to, maybe that's a strong word, because there are so many positive effects, but the difficulty of having to contend with that kind of situation is a feature of your life, something that goes with you.
So we've got about a minute left before Anne has to jump in here, but I think this actually, Adrian's question is really relevant to what you just said, which is how important class weighs in with other factors when it comes to stereotypes.
I think class is another identity to which are attached powerful stereotypes in our society. We like to think of ourselves as a classless society, but we're not. Maybe we're not as rigid about it as European society, British society, those that I know of, but we have it. And so the whole sense of me revealing to you, knowing what class I'm in, that and the stereotypes that you might have about that can definitely be a factor that in some situations quite comparable to other gender stereotypes or racial stereotypes or religious stereotypes. It can have a reality of its own. Person comes to the North. Imagine a person coming to a New England cocktail party with a Southern accent. That person's going to feel some stereotype threat about how they're going to be seen, how intelligent they're going to be seen as, and so on. So there's just an example of how class and the like can have comparable stereotype pressures.
Well, for those of us who are going to be on the video, Claude, we will see you in a moment. Thank you so much. That's all the time we have for Q&A. There were over 60 questions for you, so apologies we didn't get.
I wish I had all afternoon, but I guess we have to move.
Yeah.
Yes, that's right. We're going to let you move, but we do know that this is typical, that we always get more questions than we could ever hope for our speaker to answer. But what we want to say is thank you to our very engaged audience for their thoughtful questions and for paying such close attention, because if we don't get questions, it means that nobody's listening. So, and a lot of what I've seen in the Q&A is thank you very much for giving your talk, Claude, because this is such an important topic. So we're going to let you sign off and run over to the VIP Q&A as Rick and I wrap here, because we have 1 minute to do that, and we'll let you go. So thank you very much, Claude.
Right, thank you.
So Anne, what's our next event going to be?
So our next event is going to be with Spark Fun, the founder of Spark Fun, Nathan Seidel, who is a really interesting guy. Rick and I had the opportunity to be on a panel with him. And that's how we found out about his work. And we have since talked to him more in depth about what he's doing and what motivates him to do it. And so I think it's going to be a really interesting event, because we have the opportunity to hear a little bit of a life story from somebody who's done some pretty eclectic and interesting work, and then actually talk a bit about the technical side of that work. So Sachi will get that invitation out to you. We hope that you will RSVP and that you will join us. We're taking next week as a bye week. We're trying to do these more like every 2 weeks, and we'll be back. You were about to say something, Rick? I saw you.
I was going to say there's like a small chance that we may be dive bombing your inbox with a last minute event next week. So please keep an eye out. I don't want to irresponsibly tell you what it is without having the confirmation, but there's a small chance we'll have an event next week too.
That's right. That's partly the reason that we're doing scheduling in advance every other week, is to give us the opportunity to be more opportunistic for the bye weeks. So thank you very much for being here. And we look forward to seeing you when we are next on our stage with somebody that we know will be very interesting.
Thanks,
Thank
everybody.
you.